Part 1. Among the Ruins. The train pulled into Sanemiya station with a weary sigh, as if it too carried the weight of a city's sorrow. Kenji pressed his face against the window, watching the familiar skyline emerge through the morning haze. But this was not the Kobe of his childhood memories. Where gleaming towers once reached toward heaven, twisted metal and concrete now clawed at the sky like broken fingers. 3 weeks had passed since the earth had trembled and roared, swallowing whole neighborhoods in mere seconds. 3 weeks since the great Hanshin earthquake had rewritten the story of this proud port city. And now at 22, Kenji had returned from his university in Kyoto, not as the carefree student who had left for winter break, but as something else entirely, a volunteer, though the word felt too large for his uncertain hands. The platform buzzed with controlled chaos. Relief workers in bright orange vests moved with practiced efficiency, while families clutched photocopied flyers bearing the faces of missing loved ones. The air itself seemed different, thinner somehow, charged with a grief so palpable it made his chest tight. Kenji shouldered his backpack, heavy with supplies donated by his university classmates, and stepped into the wounded heart of his hometown. Walking through the Motomachi district, he barely recognized the streets where he had once chased fireflies on summer evenings. The elegant shopping arcades lay collapsed like accordion pleats, their once proud facades now serving as impromptu memorials adorned with flowers and incense. Every corner told a story of loss: a bicycle crushed beneath a fallen sign, a child's shoe sitting alone on a pile of rubble, a family photograph half buried in debris. At the Volunteer Coordination Center, hastily established in a surviving community center, Kenji joined a line of people who looked as lost as he felt. There were salarymen in rumpled suits who had taken leave from their companies, housewives with determined eyes and calloused hands, university students like himself clutching thermoses of coffee like talismans against the enormity of the task ahead. "First time?" asked the woman behind the folding table, her voice gentle but efficient. Her name tag read Tanaka-san, and despite the exhaustion etched around her eyes, she radiated a quiet strength that reminded Kenji of his grandmother. He nodded, suddenly aware of how young he must look, how unprepared. "Don't worry," she said, handing him a clipboard and a yellow vest. "We all felt that way. The city needs every pair of hands, every willing heart. You'll find your place." But as the day wore on, Kenji wondered if Tanaka-san's confidence was misplaced. Assigned to a search team combing through a collapsed apartment building, he felt like a child playing at being useful. The experienced rescue workers moved with purpose and skill, reading the language of destruction with practiced eyes, while he could only follow and try not to get in the way. The afternoon brought its own challenges. At a temporary shelter in an undamaged school gymnasium, families had created small worlds within the larger space. Blankets hung on ropes for privacy, children's drawings taped to walls, the elderly sitting in circles, sharing stories and instant noodles. Kenji helped distribute supplies, but every interaction felt inadequate. What were bottled water and rice balls against such profound loss? An old man in a faded yukata looked up at him with eyes that held too much history. "You're Sato-san's boy, aren't you? The one who went to Kyoto?" "Yes, sir. Kenji. Your father was a good man. Helped my family when the typhoon damaged our shop in '85. The old man's voice wavered slightly. "I suppose it's your turn now." The weight of expectation, of legacy, of a city's need settled on Kenji's shoulders like snow. He wanted to run, to return to the safe boundaries of textbooks and lecture halls where problems had solutions and effort guaranteed results. Here, in this maze of suffering and resilience, he felt utterly small. As evening approached, the volunteers gathered for a brief meeting. Tomorrow would bring the lighting of the first memorial lanterns, paper vessels carrying prayers and messages for the lost, a tradition borrowed from Obon, but adapted for this unprecedented tragedy. Tanaka-san explained the process. Families would write messages on white paper lanterns, which would then be placed throughout the affected areas as beacons of remembrance and hope. "The lanterns serve many purposes," she said, her voice carrying easily through the crowded room. "They honor our lost ones, but they also mark our presence. They say, we are here, we remember, we continue." Kenji walked back to his temporary lodging, a futon in the back room of his family's damaged but standing house. As the sun painted the broken city in shades of amber and rose, the beauty felt almost cruel against the backdrop of destruction, yet there was something fitting about it too. Life, it seemed, insisted on its small moments of grace, even in the darkest hours. That night, lying on his thin mattress and listening to the sound of distant hammering as night crews worked to clear debris, Kenji wondered what message he would write on his own lantern. What words could possibly contain the complexity of what he felt? Grief for his city's wounds, shame at his own inadequacy, and beneath it all, a stubborn flicker of something that might have been hope. Tomorrow he would learn that the lanterns were not meant to be carried alone. Part 2. Shared Light. The next evening brought Kenji to the banks of the Sumida River, where a small group of volunteers had gathered around folding tables laden with paper lanterns, brushes, and black ink. The setting sun cast long shadows across the water, and somewhere in the distance the sound of construction equipment hummed like a mechanical lullaby. Tanaka-san was there, of course, her steady presence anchoring the gathering like a lighthouse guides ships through dark waters. Beside her stood a woman Kenji didn't recognize. Middle-aged, wearing a simple black sweater, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her eyes held a depth that spoke of recent loss, yet her hands moved with practiced calm as she prepared the writing materials. "This is Nakamura-san," Tanaka-san explained to the newcomers. "She lost her home in Nagata Ward, but she's been organizing the lantern ceremonies since the second week after the earthquake." Nakamura-san bowed slightly. "The lanterns help us remember that we are not alone in our sorrow," she said simply. "When we write together, when we light them together, we share the weight." The phrase struck Kenji oddly. In his university philosophy classes, they had discussed the concept of individual responsibility, the importance of self-reliance that was so central to Japanese society. But here, in this circle of people united by catastrophe, the idea of sharing weight felt revolutionary. As the group began to work, Kenji found himself seated between an elderly gentleman in a worn business suit and a young mother whose toddler slept peacefully in a stroller, despite the activity around them. The old man's hands shook slightly as he dipped his brush in ink, and Kenji noticed that his message was written in the careful characters of someone who had learned to write before the war. "My wife," the man explained quietly, noticing Kenji's curious glance. "53 years together. She was in the kitchen when—" His voice trailed off, but his brush continued to move across the paper with surprising steadiness. The young mother was writing something entirely different. Not a memorial, but a promise. "For Yuki's future," she whispered to her sleeping child. "So she'll know her mama never stopped believing this city would rise again." Kenji stared at his own blank lantern for a long time. Around him, the soft scratch of brushes and the occasional murmur of conversation created a rhythm that felt almost meditative. The city's wounded skyline stretched before them, but somehow in this circle of quiet industry, it felt less overwhelming. Finally, he began to write. "For those who showed me that ganbate means we persist, not I endure alone." The words surprised him even as he wrote them. Where had that understanding come from? Perhaps from watching Tanaka-san coordinate volunteers with infinite patience. Perhaps from seeing Nakamura-san transform her own grief into service for others. Perhaps from the old man beside him, whose trembling hand still held his brush with dignity and purpose. As darkness settled over the city, the group moved to place their lanterns along the riverbank. Each paper vessel held a small battery-powered LED, a practical adaptation that ensured the lights would burn safely through the night. One by one, the lanterns began to glow, creating a constellation of earthbound stars that reflected in the dark water. But this was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, Kenji found himself returning to the lantern ceremonies again and again. Each night brought new faces, new stories, new messages carried on paper and light. There was the group of high school students who wrote poems for their collapsed school. The restaurant owner who crafted elaborate lanterns shaped like the dishes his destroyed business once served. The family of 4 who each wrote the same message. "We are grateful to be together." Slowly, Kenji began to understand what Nakamura-san had meant about sharing the weight. The nightly ritual of gathering, writing, and lighting created something larger than the sum of its parts. Individual sorrows became collective memory. Personal hopes joined a greater chorus of determination. During the day, he worked with increasing confidence. The search and rescue efforts gradually gave way to debris removal, then to the early stages of reconstruction planning. He learned to operate simple machinery, to sort salvageable materials from rubble, to listen with patience when survivors needed to tell their stories. Most importantly, he learned to recognize his own small part in a vast network of interdependence. At the community kitchens that sprang up in parking lots and vacant spaces, he watched neighbors who had never spoken before the earthquake work side by side to feed evacuees and volunteers. In the temporary shelters, he saw children from different schools playing together, their laughter a defiant melody against the backdrop of adult worry. The lanterns became a symbol of this collective spirit. News crews began to arrive, drawn by the powerful image of hundreds of glowing messages scattered throughout the damaged neighborhoods. The phrase "Ganbaru Kobe," hang in there Kobe, appeared on signs and banners. But Kenji now understood that Ganbaru had nothing to do with solitary endurance. It was a shared breath, drawn together by an entire city. One evening, as he helped Nakamura-san arrange a particularly large display of lanterns in American Park, she turned to him with a smile that carried the first hint of genuine joy he had seen from her. "You know," she said, "my daughter always complained that I worried too much about what the neighbors would think. She said I should be more independent, more self-sufficient." Her eyes drifted toward a lantern marked with her daughter's name. "But I think she would understand now. Sometimes the most independent thing you can do is accept that you need others. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let others help carry what you cannot carry alone." That night, Kenji wrote his longest message yet, not on a lantern, but in a letter to his university friends. He told them about the old man, whose trembling hands still created beauty, about the mother who wrote promises to her sleeping child, about a city that was learning to breathe with one shared pair of lungs. "I used to think heroism was about individual strength," he wrote. "Now I know it's about choosing to stay connected when everything else falls apart." Part 3. Stars on Earth. 3 months after the earthquake, Kenji stood in the same spot where his train had first delivered him, back to his broken city. But Sanemiya Station buzzed with a different energy now. Still urgent, still determined, but tempered with something that might have been hope. Construction cranes reached toward the sky like steel prayers, and the sound of rebuilding provided a steady percussion beneath the city's awakening song. The Memorial Lantern Project had evolved far beyond its humble beginnings by the river. What had started as small gatherings of grieving neighbors had grown into a network of light that stretched across all the affected neighborhoods. Every evening, as darkness settled over Kobe, thousands of paper lanterns bloomed like earthbound stars, each one carrying its own message but contributing to a larger illumination that could be seen from space. Kenji had become one of the project's coordinators, working alongside Tanaka-san and Nakamura-san to organize the nightly ceremonies. His days were filled with logistics, coordinating volunteers, sourcing materials, liaising with city officials who were increasingly supportive of the project's role in community healing. But the work felt different now than it had in those first overwhelming weeks. Each task was purposeful, connected to something larger than itself. On this particular evening, a group of international volunteers had joined the regular participants. There was Sarah, a teacher from California who had taken a leave of absence to help with relief efforts. Hiroshi, a Japanese-American businessman from Seattle who had come to honor his grandparents' homeland. Marie, a nurse from France who spoke broken Japanese, but whose gentle hands needed no translation as she helped elderly participants with their brushes. "It's remarkable," Sarah said to Kenji as they prepared the materials. "In the States, we tend to think of disaster recovery as a series of individual struggles. Insurance claims, FEMA assistance, personal rebuilding efforts. But this," she gestured toward the gathering crowd of participants, "this is something entirely different." Kenji nodded, thinking of his own journey from that first day when he had felt so small and useless among the ruins. "We have a saying," he replied, "the nail that sticks up gets hammered down." But maybe that's not the whole story. Maybe sometimes the nails that stick up together can hold up the whole house. As the ceremony began, Kenji found himself partnered with a young girl named Hana, whose family had lost their home in Nagata Ward. She was perhaps 8 years old, with serious dark eyes and a concentration that reminded him of master calligraphers he had seen in temples. Her lantern was decorated with careful drawings of cherry blossoms, not the pale pink ones of spring, but bold red ones that blazed like tiny fires across the paper. My Obasan taught me to draw these, she explained in the matter-of-fact way children have of discussing profound things. She said the cherry blossoms don't bloom to show off. They bloom because it's time to bloom, even if the winter was very hard. Kenji watched her write her message with slow, careful strokes. For everyone who helped us remember how to bloom. Around them, the familiar rhythm of the ceremony unfolded. Nakamura-san moved among the participants with quiet grace, offering encouragement and assistance. The old businessman was there again. Kenji had learned his name was Watanabe-san, still writing messages to his departed wife. Though now his letters often included news of the city's progress, small victories and moments of beauty he wanted to share with her. As the lanterns were lit and placed throughout the area, something magical happened. The individual lights began to create patterns, not planned or orchestrated, but organic, like the way starlings move together in the sky. From the elevated position of a nearby footbridge, the display looked like a vast circuit board of connection, each light both independent and part of a greater design. Television crews had arrived to document the 3-month anniversary of the earthquake, but their presence felt less intrusive now. The lantern ceremonies had become part of Kobe's story, a visual representation of the city's commitment to healing through connection rather than isolation. As midnight approached and the official ceremony wound down, a smaller group remained to tend the lanterns through the night. This had become another tradition, the overnight vigil that ensured the lights would burn until dawn, when the city would wake to find itself still illuminated by messages of hope and remembrance. Kenji volunteered for the late shift, as he often did. There was something profound about watching over the sleeping city, surrounded by the gentle glow of thousands of paper vessels carrying human hopes and sorrows. During these quiet hours, he often thought about the transformation he had witnessed, not just in the physical rebuilding of streets and buildings, but in the way people related to one another. The earthquake had shattered the carefully maintained boundaries between private and public life, between individual struggle and collective responsibility. In the aftermath, something new had emerged, a recognition that resilience was not a personal virtue, but a community practice, not a solo performance, but a chorus. Around 3 a.m., as Kenji was replacing the battery in a dimming lantern, he was joined by a figure he recognized, Dr. Yamamoto, a psychiatrist who had been studying the psychological impact of the disaster on survivors. They had met several times during the relief efforts, and Kenji had been impressed by the doctor's insight into the healing power of shared ritual. "You know," Dr. Yamamoto said quietly, settling beside him on the park bench, "I've been documenting recovery patterns across different affected communities. The neighborhoods with the strongest lantern programs are showing significantly better outcomes in terms of mental health, social cohesion, and even economic recovery." "Does that surprise you?" Kenji asked. "Not really, but it challenges a lot of assumptions about Japanese society. This idea that we're naturally resilient because we've learned to endure in isolation. What you've created here suggests something different. It suggests that our real strength comes from our ability to be vulnerable together, to admit that we need each other." As dawn approached, the lantern's glow began to fade against the growing light, but the messages remained, thousands of paper witnesses to a city's refusal to surrender to despair. Some of the lanterns would be collected and archived, becoming part of a permanent memorial. Others would naturally decompose, returning their hopes to the earth that had shaken but not broken the community's spirit. Kenji walked home through streets that bore the scars of catastrophe, but also the signs of regeneration. New buildings rose alongside repaired ones. Children played in parks that had been rubble fields just months before. Early commuters hurried toward reconstructed train stations, carrying briefcases and hope in equal measure. At his family's house, now fully repaired and stronger than before, he found a note from his mother, who had returned from staying with relatives in Osaka. "Kenji," it read, "I'm proud of what you've done here. Your father would be proud too. You've learned that Ganbat is not about being strong alone. You've learned it's about choosing to be weak together so that everyone can become strong." That evening, as he prepared for another lantern ceremony, Kenji reflected on the journey that had brought him from that first overwhelming day among the ruins to this moment of purposeful action. The city had changed, certainly. New buildings, new infrastructure, new systems for disaster preparedness. But the deeper change was in the understanding of what it meant to persist, what it meant to endure, what it meant to hope. The lanterns had taught them all that light is most beautiful when it is shared, that messages of love and loss and determination are most powerful when they illuminate not just individual experiences, but collective dreams. In learning to tend each other's lights, they had discovered their own ability to shine. As the sun set over Kobe and the first lanterns began to glow in the gathering darkness, Kenji smiled. Tonight, like every night since that first ceremony by the river, the city would sleep beneath a constellation of paper stars, each one carrying a fragment of the human story, each one contributing to a larger illumination that promised that no matter how dark the night, dawn would always find them still burning, still hoping, still together. The earthquake had taught them that the earth itself could not be trusted to remain steady, but the lanterns had taught them something more important, that they could be steady for each other, that collective light could outlast any darkness, and that the most profound form of resistance to despair was the simple act of writing hope on paper and trusting others to help it shine. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the rebuilt city, carrying new arrivals toward their own discoveries of what it meant to Gambaru, to persist not in isolation, but in the warm, illuminated company of fellow travelers on the long journey toward healing. Act 1. The Rain That Taught Me. I remember the sound first, not of breaking, but of settling, like autumn leaves finding their place on still water, or the way tatami mats whisper when you walk across them in stockinged feet. It was the sound of my world rearranging itself, quietly, inevitably, the way rivers change their course grain by grain. The rain had been falling for 3 days when I received the letter. Not the harsh, urgent rain that demands attention, but the patient kind that speaks in whispers, drumming softly against the curved tiles of my small house in the mountains outside Kyoto. Each drop seemed to pause before touching the earth, as if asking permission, as if understanding that some things must be approached gently. I was sitting in my study, surrounded by the familiar smell of aged wood and the faint trace of sandalwood from the incense I had lit that morning. The morning ritual, lighting the incense, brewing tea, sitting in the small pocket of silence before the day began, had become my anchor in those uncertain times. Ma, my grandmother used to call it, that space between breaths, between thoughts, between one moment and the next. Learn to love the Ma, she would whisper, for it is there that life happens. The envelope was cream-colored, formal, the kind that carries news you know will change everything. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it, not from fear, but from a recognition deep in my bones that this was a moment that would be remembered. Inside, the words were simple, final. The research position I had worked toward for 15 years would not be renewed. Budget cuts, restructuring, the familiar language of endings dressed up to sound like beginnings. I set the letter down on the low wooden table that had belonged to my grandfather, next to the steaming cup of sencha I had been about to drink. The tea's green fragrance mixed with the incense and the smell of rain-washed air drifting through the partially opened shoji screen. For a long moment, I simply sat, listening to the rain's gentle percussion and feeling the way shock settles into the body like sediment in still water. Mono no aware, I thought, remembering another of grandmother's teachings. The bittersweet awareness of the impermanence of all things. The cherry blossoms that bloom so briefly. The seasons that turn without asking our permission. The way light changes throughout a single day. She had taught me that this awareness wasn't meant to make us sad, but to make us tender, to help us hold each moment with the reverence it deserved. I picked up the teacup, a simple ceramic piece with a small chip near the rim that I had grown to love, and took a sip. The tea was still warm, still perfect, still offering itself to this moment, despite the fact that everything had changed. This is what grandmother meant, I realized. The tea doesn't stop being tea because I received difficult news. The rain doesn't stop falling because my plans have crumbled. The world continues its quiet work of being beautiful, one breath at a time. Outside, I could hear the subtle sounds of my neighbor, Tanaka-san, moving about his garden. He was 93 years old and still tended his vegetables with the same careful attention he had given them for decades. Every morning, regardless of weather, he would emerge from his house wearing the same faded blue work clothes, carrying the same wooden bucket, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who understood that persistence is not about force, but about showing up day after day with gentle consistency. I had learned much from watching Tanaka-san in the 2 years since I had moved to this small mountain community. He had lived through the war, through decades of change that had transformed Japan from ruins to prosperity, and back through various challenges. His garden had been destroyed twice, once by a landslide, once by an unexpected late frost that killed everything he had planted. Each time I had watched him survey the damage with the same calm expression, then quietly begin again. "Ganbata," he had said to me once, when I had offered to help him replant after the frost. At first I thought it was simply encouragement, the common expression that means something like, "do your best," or "hang in there." But as I worked alongside him, carefully placing each seed in the dark earth, I began to understand that he meant something deeper. Ganbat isn't just about individual effort, I realized as we worked in comfortable silence. It's about the shared understanding that we face difficulties together, that persistence is not a solitary act, but a communal one. When Tanaka-san said "ganbate," he wasn't just encouraging me to try harder. He was acknowledging that we are all connected in our struggles, that my efforts and his efforts were part of the same larger movement toward healing, toward growth, toward tomorrow. Now, sitting with my own unexpected frost, I found myself thinking of Tanaka-san's garden, of the way he had approached destruction, not with anger or despair, but with the quiet recognition that this too was part of the cycle. Wabi-sabi, grandmother had called it, finding beauty in imperfection, in impermanence, in the cracks that let the light in. The rain continued its patient work outside, and I realized I could sit here forever, held by its rhythm, protected by this small house that smelled of sandalwood and memory. But something was stirring in me, a recognition that this moment, difficult as it was also a doorway. Perhaps the end of one path was simply the beginning of another, the way winter is necessary for spring, the way broken ground prepares the soil for new growth. I finished my tea slowly, savoring each sip, then rose to dress for a walk in the rain. If Tanaka-san could tend his garden regardless of weather, surely I could venture out into the uncertainty of this new day. The rain would soak through my clothes, would make everything more difficult, but it would also wash the air clean, would bring the scent of earth and growing things, would remind me that I was part of something larger than my own small fears. As I slipped on my rain jacket and boots, I thought about the stories grandmother used to tell about the time after the war, when everything had been broken and the future was uncertain. We didn't know what would happen, she would say, but we knew we would face it together. Ganbata wasn't just a word then, it was how we survived. I stepped out into the gentle rain, feeling it welcome me with its soft touch. The path down to the village was muddy but familiar, lined with bamboo that whispered secrets to the wind and small shrines that had watched over this mountain for generations. Each step felt like a small act of faith, a quiet declaration that I would continue forward even when I couldn't see where the path led. The rain seemed to be washing more than just the dust from the leaves and stones. With each step, I felt some of the tight fear in my chest beginning to loosen, replaced by something I couldn't quite name yet. Not hope exactly, but perhaps its quieter cousin, acceptance. The recognition that this too was part of my story, that difficulties are not obstacles to life, but weavings in its fabric. By the time I reached the village center, my clothes were thoroughly soaked, but I felt more present than I had in weeks. The few people I passed nodded and smiled, their faces kind under umbrellas and rain hoods. Mrs. Yamamoto, who ran the small grocery store, called out, "Otsukare-sama," a greeting that acknowledges the effort we put into our daily lives, that honors the work of simply being human. I ducked into the small cafe that served as the village's unofficial community center, shaking the rain from my jacket and settling at a table by the window. The proprietor, a man in his 60s named Sato-san, brought me a hot towel and a cup of coffee without being asked. This too was part of Ganbate, I realized. The way communities take care of each other. The small acts of kindness that weave us together into something stronger than any of us could be alone. Taihen deshitane, Sato-san said gently, and I knew somehow that he was referring not to the rain, but to whatever had brought me here looking bedraggled and thoughtful. It's been tough, hasn't it? The phrase carried weight, acknowledgement, solidarity. I nodded, not trusting my voice yet, and he simply smiled and returned to his work behind the counter. This too was Ma, the space he was giving me to feel what I needed to feel. The understanding that sometimes presence is more helpful than words. As I sat warming my hands around the coffee cup, watching the rain trace patterns down the window, I began to understand that today was not just about losing a job. It was about learning something I had known intellectually, but never felt in my bones. That resilience is not about being strong enough to face difficulties alone, but about being wise enough to let yourself be held by something larger than your own will. The rain continued to fall, and I continued to sit, and somewhere in that simple persistence, the rain's mine, the quiet communities, I felt the first stirring of what would carry me forward. Not answers yet, but the beginning of trust that answers would come. The way spring comes after winter, the way dawn comes after the longest night. Ganbata, I whispered to myself, and felt the words settle into my bones like a promise. Act 2, the Garden of Collective Grace. The next morning dawned clear and washed, the kind of clarity that only comes after rain has cleaned the world overnight. I woke before sunrise, drawn by some internal calling to witness the transition from darkness to light. In the distance, I could hear the soft sounds of Tanaka-san already moving about his garden, beginning the day's gentle work of tending and care. I made my morning tea, the ritual feeling even more sacred after yesterday's upheaval, and stepped onto my small veranda to watch the sun emerge from behind the mountains. The air smelled of petrichor and possibility, that particular freshness that speaks of new beginnings nested within eternal cycles. As the light strengthened, I saw something that made me pause. There at the edge of my small garden, someone had left a bundle wrapped in cloth. I approached it slowly, curious rather than alarmed. In this mountain community, mysterious gifts usually carried only kindness. Inside the cloth were seed packets, carefully labeled in Tanaka-san's precise handwriting. Radishes, spinach, carrots, herbs. Vegetables that could be planted now in the uncertain season between summer and fall. At the bottom of the bundle was a small piece of paper with just one word, Ganbat. I stood holding these seeds, these promises of future meals and seasons of tending, and felt something shift inside my chest. This wasn't charity in the way I had understood it, the kind that comes from pity or obligation. This was something deeper, recognition. Tanaka-san had seen me as someone who, like him, understood that the way forward often begins with placing seeds in dark earth and trusting in processes larger than our individual will. I spent that morning preparing a small plot in my garden, turning the soil that had been hardened by the summer heat, working compost into its depths the way Tanaka-san had taught me. The physical work felt good after weeks of sitting at desks and computer screens, the kind of labor that connects mind and body, that reminds you that thinking and doing are not separate activities but different aspects of the same engagement with life. As I worked, neighbors began to appear, as if drawn by some invisible signal. First came Mrs. Kimura, who lived in the house with the blue gate, carrying a thermos of tea and a small cushion. She settled nearby and began to shell beans from her own garden, working with the unhurried rhythm of someone who understood that the best conversations happen alongside shared work. Starting fresh, I see, she said, not asking about my circumstances, but somehow knowing that this garden work was connected to larger transitions. This is how mountain communities work. Information travels not through gossip, but through a deeper attunement to each other's rhythms, an ability to sense when someone is navigating change. Soon others joined us. Tanaka-san appeared with additional tools and wisdom about which seeds did best in which spots. Young Kenji, who was home from university for the harvest season, brought music from a small speaker that played traditional folk songs at just the right volume to accompany but not dominate our work. Mrs. Yamamoto arrived with rice balls wrapped in nori, sustenance to fuel the morning's efforts. We worked mostly in silence, but it was the rich silence of shared purpose, punctuated by gentle laughter when someone made a joke, or the soft sound of tools meeting earth, or the rustle of leaves as a breeze moved through the nearby bamboo grove. This too was Ma, the spaces between words that allowed the deeper communication to happen. I found myself thinking about grandmother's stories of the years after the war, when entire communities would come together to rebuild not just buildings, but the fabric of daily life itself. She had described the way people would share whatever they had, a handful of rice, a day's labor, a song to lift spirits during the hardest work. We didn't have much, she would say, but what we had, we shared, and somehow it was enough. Watching my neighbors now, I began to understand what she meant. Mrs. Kimura's beans, Tanaka-san's knowledge, Kenji's music, Mrs. Yamamoto's rice balls. None of these things alone would solve the larger problems any of us faced, but woven together, they created something that was more than the sum of its parts. A sense that we were not facing our difficulties alone, that there was a web of support and care that would hold us through whatever came next. By noon, we had planted 3 times as many seeds as I had originally planned. The small plot had expanded organically as people pointed out other suitable spots, as someone remembered additional seeds in their shed, as the work revealed its own logic. What had started as my attempt to respond to personal crisis had become something larger. A community garden that would feed all of us through the winter months. "This is how it always is," Tanaka-san said as we cleaned our tools, speaking in the mixture of Japanese and English that had become our comfortable way of communicating. One person starts, but the work teaches us what it wants to become. He was right, I realized. I had come to the garden this morning thinking I was learning to tend plants, but I was actually learning to tend community. The seeds were important, but they were also a medium for something deeper, the practice of showing up for each other, day after day, season after season. That afternoon, as the others returned to their own homes and responsibilities, I sat in my study looking out at the transformed garden. The neat rows of newly planted seeds were barely visible, but I could feel their presence like a promise. In a few weeks, green shoots would emerge. In a few months, we would harvest the fruits of today's collective labor. I thought about the research position I had lost and realized that my grief for it had shifted. It was still there, the disappointment, the uncertainty about the future. But it no longer felt like the end of something. Instead, it felt like the space between plantings, the fallow period that allows soil to regenerate, that makes new growth possible. Kintsugi, I remembered grandmother explaining once as she showed me a bowl that had been broken and repaired with gold. The Japanese art of mending pottery with precious metals, making the break lines visible and beautiful rather than hiding them. "The bowl is more beautiful now than it was before it broke," she had said. "The cracks are part of its story, part of what makes it precious." Perhaps this was what I was learning in my own life. The loss of my job, the forced change of direction, the uncertainty. These were cracks in the vessel of my planned life. But maybe with time and the right kind of tending, those cracks could become lines of strength, places where new light could enter. That evening, I received a phone call from Dr. Hashimoto, a colleague from the university who had heard about my situation. But instead of offering condolences or advice, she had a different kind of proposal. "I've been thinking about starting a community education project," she said, "something that brings academic knowledge into rural communities, but also learns from the wisdom that already exists there. Would you be interested in developing it together?" As she described her vision, I found myself looking out at the garden where we had planted seeds that morning, thinking about the way knowledge had flowed in multiple directions. My academic training in environmental science meeting Tanaka-san's decades of practical experience, Mrs. Kimura's understanding of seasonal rhythms teaching me things no textbook had ever mentioned. "It wouldn't pay much at first," Dr. Hashimoto continued, "but there might be grant funding, and it would be something entirely new, a chance to reimagine what education could look like." I found myself saying yes before I had consciously decided, the word emerging from some deeper knowing that recognized opportunity when it appeared. This was what grandmother meant about Genbari, I realized. It wasn't just about enduring difficulty. It was about remaining open to the possibilities that difficulty makes visible. about trusting that endings and beginnings are often the same moment seen from different angles. After I hung up, I made my evening tea and sat on the veranda, watching the sun set over the mountains. The garden looked different now than it had this morning, not just because of the physical changes, but because of what I understood about it. It was no longer just my small plot of land, but a node in a larger network of care and cultivation that stretched through time and across relationships I was only beginning to perceive. The sound of evening insects began to rise, a gentle symphony that would continue through the night. In a few hours, the seeds we had planted would begin their invisible work of germination, splitting open in the dark earth, reaching toward a light they had never seen but somehow knew was waiting. I thought about tomorrow, about the conversation I would have with Dr. Hashimoto to explore this new possibility, about the seeds that would need watering, about the way forward that was revealing itself step by careful step. The future still felt uncertain, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full of potential, like dark soil enriched by rain and compost, ready to support whatever wanted to grow. Ganbata, I whispered to the garden, to the mountains, to whatever forces had conspired to bring me to this moment of quiet recognition. And in the distance, I thought I heard the mountains whisper back, their ancient voices carrying the promise that tomorrow would bring its own opportunities for tending, its own invitations to participate in the endless work of cultivation and care. The stars emerged one by one, and I remained on the veranda, held by the gentle sounds of night settling over the valley. This too was part of Gambat. I understood now. Not just the active work of moving forward, but also the quiet work of witnessing, of allowing ourselves to be present to each moment as it unfolds, of trusting in processes larger than our individual understanding. The tea grew cold in my hands, but I continued to sit, learning the particular quality of peace that comes when we stop trying to force outcomes and instead align ourselves with the natural rhythms of growth and change. This was the spirit that had carried Japan through its darkest periods, the recognition that resilience is not about resisting difficulty, but about flowing with it, finding ways to bend without breaking, to plant seeds even in uncertain ground. Act 3, the light that gathers us. 3 months had passed since that morning of planting seeds, and the garden had become something none of us had quite anticipated. What started as a small plot for winter vegetables had grown into a gathering place, a note of connection that drew neighbors not just for the practical work of tending plants, but for the deeper nourishment of shared purpose and community care. I was harvesting radishes on a crisp October morning when Mrs. Chen arrived. She was new to our village, having moved here after her husband's death to be closer to her daughter's family. Like many of us, she had come carrying loss, looking for a way to rebuild life in a smaller, quieter scale. "I brought this," she said, holding out a small paper bag. Inside were garlic cloves saved from her previous garden. In my country, we say that when you plant garlic, you plant hope for next year's harvest. It takes time to grow, but it keeps well through the winter. Tanaka-san looked up from where he was building a small shelter for the tools we now shared. At 83, he moved more slowly than he had in the spring, but with no less purpose. "Garlic is wise," he said in his quiet way. "It knows how to wait underground, how to grow strong in darkness. Good teacher for us." We spent that morning planting Mrs. Chen's garlic, working the cloves into the soil that had been enriched by months of communal tending. As we worked, she told us about her previous garden, about the community of women who had shared seeds and knowledge across back fences, about the particular grief of leaving behind growing things when life requires you to start over somewhere new. "But seeds carry memory," she said, patting the earth over the newly planted garlic. "These cloves remember the soil they came from, but they will learn to love this earth too, just like us." Her words settled over our small group with the weight of recognition. Each of us, in our own way, was learning to love new earth, to plant hope in unfamiliar ground. Mrs. Kimura, whose children had moved to the city and rarely visited, young Kenji, who was struggling to decide whether to return to university or stay to help with his aging parents, Mrs. Yamamoto, whose small store was barely surviving the economic changes that had emptied so many mountain villages. The community education project that Dr. Hashimoto and I had developed was taking shape too, growing organically like the garden itself. What had started as an academic idea had become something more practical and immediate. A series of workshops where university researchers like myself worked alongside community members to explore questions that mattered to everyone. Our first formal session was scheduled for the following week, and I found myself both excited and nervous about how it would unfold. We had planned to focus on sustainable agriculture, bringing together my training in environmental science with the practical knowledge that people like Tanaka-san had accumulated through decades of careful observation. But I suspected that what we would actually explore would be larger and more subtle: how knowledge moves between generations, how communities adapt to change, how traditional wisdom and contemporary research can inform each other. That afternoon, I walked to the small community center where we would hold our sessions. It was a modest building, built in the 1960s with donated labor and materials, the kind of space that carries the fingerprints and care of everyone who has ever used it. The wooden floors creaked in a comfortable way, and the large windows faced the mountains, offering a view that changed with the light throughout the day. As I swept the floors and arranged chairs in a circle, I thought about the different kinds of spaces where learning happens. University classrooms, with their rows of desks and fluorescent lighting, designed to focus attention on a single speaker. But also gardens, where knowledge passes through hands and seasons. Kitchens, where recipes carry the history of families and regions. Mountain paths, where the act of walking together creates its own form of dialogue. Our community education project was an experiment in creating a different kind of learning space, one that honored multiple ways of knowing and being. I wasn't sure if it would work, but I was learning that success might be measured not in outcomes, but in the quality of attention we brought to the process, the depth of listening we cultivated, the bridges we built between different forms of wisdom. That evening, I sat in my study reviewing my notes and feeling the familiar flutter of pre-teaching nerves. But underneath the nervousness was something steadier: gratitude. The path that had led me here, through job loss and uncertainty, through morning gardens and community planting, had taught me things I couldn't have learned any other way. I thought about the email I had received that afternoon from my former supervisor at the university, asking if I would consider returning to a modified version of my previous position. The department had received new funding, he explained, and there might be opportunities to continue my research while also developing community partnerships. 6 months ago, this offer would have been exactly what I thought I wanted. Now I found myself considering it with curiosity rather than immediate relief. The question wasn't whether I could return to my old life, but whether I wanted to. The seeds I had planted, literal and metaphorical, were just beginning to sprout. The community connections I had developed were still new and fragile. The project Dr. Hashimoto and I were creating together had potential I was only beginning to understand. I decided to sleep on the decision, to let it settle in the same way I had learned to let seeds rest in dark earth, trusting that clarity would emerge in its own time. The next morning brought the first frost of the season. I woke to find the garden transformed, each blade of grass outlined in silver, the last tomato plants blackened but somehow beautiful in their honest surrender to the season. This is what autumn teaches, I thought as I walked among the frost-touched plants. That endings and beginnings are woven together. That death and dormancy are not opposite to life, but part of its eternal cycling. Tanaka-san was already in the garden, harvesting the last of the peppers and carefully covering the garlic bed with straw mulch. Frost came early this year, he said, but without complaint. His tone carried the acceptance that comes from decades of partnership with weather and seasons, the understanding that our plans are always in conversation with forces larger than our intentions. Will the garlic be okay? I asked, thinking of Mrs. Chen's gift, her hope planted in our shared earth. Garlic likes the cold, Tanaka-san smiled. Makes it strong. Some things need to go through winter to become what they're meant to be. As we worked together, protecting the tender plants and harvesting the ready ones, I thought about his words. Some things need to go through winter to become what they're meant to be. The job loss that had felt like destruction 6 months ago, the uncertainty that had driven me to plant seeds in desperation, the community connections that had grown from shared work. Maybe all of this had been a kind of winter, a necessary period of dormancy and deep growth that was preparing something new to emerge. That afternoon, the first participants began arriving for our community education session. They came carrying different kinds of knowledge and experience. Farmers and university students, retirees and young parents, people who had lived in these mountains for generations, and others who had recently arrived seeking a different way of life. Dr. Hashimoto opened our session not with a lecture, but with a question. What have you learned from the land that no book ever taught you? The responses that followed created a kind of map of local wisdom. How to read the behavior of insects to predict weather changes, which wild plants are edible in different seasons, how the angle of light in late summer tells you when to plant certain crops for spring harvest. But something else emerged too, something I hadn't expected. As people shared their knowledge, they also shared their stories, how their grandparents had survived difficult seasons, what it means to tend something over many years, how communities have historically supported each other through change and challenge. Mrs. Chen spoke about the community gardens she had known as a child, how neighbors would share not just vegetables, but childcare, how the knowledge of when to plant and harvest was passed down through networks of relationship rather than formal instruction. Kenji talked about learning to read the forest from his grandfather, how to know which mushrooms were safe to gather, how the health of trees reflects the health of entire ecosystems. Young Mariko, a recent graduate who had returned to help run her family's small farm, shared her experiments with combining traditional practices and contemporary soil science, how she was using both her grandmother's knowledge about companion planting and recent research about soil microorganisms to improve their land's productivity. As the afternoon unfolded, I realized that our session had become something more than I had planned. We weren't just sharing information. We were weaving together different ways of knowing, creating a living map of how communities learn and adapt over time. This was what grandmother had meant when she talked about ganbate as more than individual effort. It was the recognition that our knowledge, like our resilience, is collective, that we are stronger when we learn from each other's wisdom and experience. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat in the community center as the light faded, making notes about what had emerged and planning for our next gathering. Through the windows, I could see lights beginning to come on in houses scattered across the valley, each one representing lives being lived with care and intention, communities of support that extend beyond what we can see. I pulled out my phone and called my former supervisor. When he answered, I could hear the familiar sounds of the university in the background, students talking, printers running, the constant hum of institutional life. I've been thinking about your offer, I said. I'm honored that you thought of me, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. But I think I need to see where this current path leads. He was gracious in his response, understanding in the way that good mentors are when their students choose directions they hadn't anticipated. We talked for a while about the community education project, about different models for bridging academic and local knowledge, about the possibility of future collaborations that might benefit both university and community. After we hung up, I sat for a while longer in the gathering darkness, feeling the weight of my decisions settle into my body. This was what Ganbat meant. I understood now. Not just persistence in the face of difficulty, but the courage to choose the path that leads toward greater connection, greater service, greater alignment with the work that wants to be born through us. The decision felt right in my bones, the way planting seeds at the correct depth feels right to experienced hands, the way a well-tuned instrument resonates when played with skill and care. I had learned to trust this feeling over the past months, to listen to the wisdom that emerges when we align ourselves with purposes larger than our individual ambitions. Outside, the first stars were appearing, and I could smell the scent of wood smoke from chimneys being lit against the growing cold. Winter was coming, and with it the season of rest and planning, of repair and preparation. The garlic bulbs we had planted would spend these months developing their root systems in darkness, gathering strength for the spring growth that was still invisible, but already inevitable. I walked home slowly, stopping to check on the garden one more time. In the moonlight, the straw mulch covering the garlic bed looked like a blanket tucked around sleeping children. Mrs. Chen's gift of hope, planted in our shared earth, resting safely through the cold season, preparing to emerge transformed when the time was right. At my front door, I paused to listen to the sound of the night settling over our small community. The whisper of wind through bamboo, the distant call of an owl, the almost inaudible sound of streams finding their way down the mountain. These sounds that I had learned to recognize and love, that marked the rhythm of days and seasons in this place that had become home. Inside, I made my evening tea and sat at the low table where I had read that first difficult letter so many months ago. The tea was the same blend I had always used, the ritual unchanged, but I was different. Not because my circumstances had improved, but because I had learned to trust in processes larger than my individual will, to plant seeds in uncertain ground, to find strength in connection with community and place. Tomorrow would bring its own work, planning the next community education session, tending the winter garden, continuing the slow process of learning how to serve something larger than my own ambitions. But tonight, I sat quietly with my tea, held by the sound of rain beginning to fall, the gentle, patient rain that knows how to nourish sleeping seeds, how to prepare the ground for whatever wants to grow next. Ganbata, I whispered to the rain, to the garden, to the invisible network of care and connection that held all of us. And in the silence that followed, I felt the rain whisper back, its voice carrying the promise of spring hidden in winter's heart, the assurance that what we plant with love and tend with patience will find its own way toward the light. The rain continued through the night, and I slept deeply, dreaming of gardens that span generations, of knowledge passed hand to hand like seeds, of communities that knew how to hold each other through the seasons of difficulty and growth. In my dreams, the spirit of Ganbata was not a word but a way of being, not something we do but something we become when we learn to trust in the wisdom of collective care, when we understand that our individual resilience is woven from threads of connection that extend far beyond what we can see. When I woke, the rain had stopped and a new day was beginning, bright with possibility and rich with the promise of work that matters, work that connects us to each other and to the earth that holds us all. The seeds we had planted in gardens and communities, in relationships and projects, in hearts prepared by difficulty to receive new forms of hope, were stirring in the dark, beginning the slow work of transformation that would carry us all toward whatever spring was waiting to be born. Ganbata, the morning whispered, and I rose to meet it with gratitude, ready for another day of tending, another day of learning how to plant hope in uncertain ground, another day of discovering what becomes possible when we face our challenges not alone, but woven together in the endless work of collective care.